My name is Daniel Harper, and the day my mother stood up in a lawyer's office screaming that she deserved millions from my uncle's estate, I finally told everyone what she had done to me when I was 13 years old. The room went silent. My mother's face drained of color. Several relatives stared at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Then the attorney opened a thick folder and quietly said, "Mr. Richard Harper anticipated this moment." What happened next destroyed the story my parents had spent 15 years telling people. But to understand why that day mattered, you have to go back to a cold October evening in Ohio when I learned that blood doesn't always make a family. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people still mowed their lawns every Saturday and waved at neighbors from their front porches. From the outside, my family looked normal. Inside our house, things were different. My father, Tom Harper, worked at a local auto parts warehouse. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at a dental office. And then there was my younger brother, Kyle. Kyle could do no wrong. At least that's how it seemed to me. If Kyle forgot to do his chores, he was just being a kid. If I forgot, I was irresponsible. If Kyle got a bad grade, he needed encouragement. If I got a bad grade, I was lazy. For years, I told myself I was imagining it. Plenty of kids think their siblings are favorites. But as I got older, the differences became impossible to ignore. My parents attended every baseball game Kyle played. When I joined the debate team and made it to a regional competition, neither of them showed up. Little things piled up over time. Then bigger things followed. By the time I turned 13, our relationship had become a constant battlefield. I was a stubborn teenager, I'll admit that. I argued. I pushed back. I questioned rules. But I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't violent. I was just a kid trying to figure out where I belonged. Unfortunately, my parents seemed to have already decided that I didn't belong with them. The final fight happened on a rainy Thursday evening. I remember every detail. The smell of meatloaf in the kitchen. The sound of rain hitting the windows. The yellow light above the dining room table. Kyle had broken an expensive lamp while roughhousing in the living room. When my father came home and saw the damage, Kyle immediately blamed me. Normally, I would have expected my parents to ask questions. Instead, my father looked directly at me. "Why do you keep causing problems?" I was stunned. I didn't touch the lamp. Kyle looked at the floor. My mother folded her arms. "Your brother says otherwise." "He's lying." The argument escalated quickly. Voices got louder. Years of resentment spilled out from all sides. For the first time, I said exactly what I had been thinking for years. "You always believe him, you never believe me." My father slammed his hand on the table. "Watch your mouth." "No," I said. "I'm tired of pretending." That was the moment everything changed. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. Then he said words I will never forget. "Maybe we'd all be better off if you lived somewhere else." At first I thought he was angry and didn't mean it. Then my mother nodded. Actually nodded. "You're making this family miserable," she said. I stared at her. I honestly thought she would take it back. She didn't. Instead, she stood up and walked to my room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a duffel bag. She tossed it onto the floor beside me. "Pack your things." I remember feeling numb. I kept waiting for someone to stop the madness. No one did. I packed clothes with shaking hands. I packed a few books. Some photographs. A baseball glove. The entire time, neither parent tried to comfort me. Kyle stayed upstairs. I never even saw him. When I finished packing, I stood in the living room holding the bag. Where am I supposed to go? My father shrugged. I don't know. To this day, that shrug hurts more than the words. An hour later, I sat alone on the front porch while rain fell across the neighborhood. I had nowhere to go. No friends whose families could take me in. No grandparents nearby. Just darkness and cold October air. That's when headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A black Lincoln sedan pulled up. The driver stepped out. My Uncle Richard. Richard Harper was my father's older brother. He lived near Chicago and owned a successful manufacturing company. Even as a kid, I knew he was wealthy. But I also knew something more important. He was kind. He visited only a few times each year, but whenever he came, he treated me like I mattered. He walked toward the porch. "What happened?" I tried to answer. Instead, I started crying. Hard. The kind of crying you can't control. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. Uncle Richard sat beside me and waited. When I finally told him everything, his jaw tightened. He walked into the house. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. I couldn't hear every word. But I heard enough. I heard my father yelling. I heard Uncle Richard yelling louder. And then I heard a sentence that changed my life. "If you don't want him," Uncle Richard said, "I'll take him." A few minutes later, he came back outside. He picked up my duffel bag. Then he looked directly at me. "You coming with me, kid?" I nodded. As we walked toward the car, my mother stepped onto the porch. For a moment I thought she might stop me. Maybe apologize. Maybe hug me. Maybe tell me she loved me. Instead, she crossed her arms. "Don't expect us to come looking for you." Those were the last words she spoke to me for 15 years. I climbed into Uncle Richard's car. As we drove away from the only home I had ever known, I looked through the rear window and watched my parents disappear into the darkness. I thought my life was over. I had no idea that night would become the beginning of everything. The drive from Ohio to Illinois took nearly 6 hours. For most of the trip, I stared out the passenger side window and watched the world blur past. Cornfields, gas stations, truck stops, small towns. Everything felt unreal. Every few minutes I expected my father to call. I expected my mother to realize what they had done and tell me to come home. The phone never rang. Around midnight, Uncle Richard pulled into the driveway of a large brick house in a quiet suburb outside Chicago. Compared to our modest home in Ohio, it looked enormous. But it wasn't flashy. No giant gates. No sports cars. No signs of extravagance. Just a well-kept home in a peaceful neighborhood. When we walked inside, he showed me a guest room. "It's yours as long as you need it." I stood there awkwardly. What if they changed their minds? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I wouldn't fully understand until years later. People reveal who they are when life gets difficult. At 13, those words didn't mean much. At 58, I understand them perfectly. The next morning, Uncle Richard made pancakes. Not because he was a great cook. Actually, they were slightly burned. But because he was trying. That mattered. Over the next few weeks, he handled everything. School enrollment, medical paperwork, clothing, counseling appointments, things parents are supposed to do. The legal situation turned out to be simpler than expected. When social services contacted my parents, they made it clear they had no interest in taking me back. Eventually, Uncle Richard became my legal guardian. The process hurt more than I can describe. Every document felt like another confirmation that I had been abandoned. Yet somehow each signature also made me feel safer. For the first time in years, I knew where I belonged. School wasn't easy at first. I was the new kid, the angry kid, the kid who had suddenly moved states. I carried a lot of bitterness. Sometimes I got into arguments. Sometimes I withdrew completely. But Uncle Richard never gave up on me. One evening after I'd been suspended for mouthing off to a teacher, I expected him to yell. Instead, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. "What are you so angry about?" The question caught me off guard. Nobody had asked that before. They usually asked what I did wrong, not why. I stared at my hands. Finally, I answered honestly, "My parents didn't want me." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Daniel, what other people do says something about them, not about you." At the time, I wasn't sure I believed him. But I remembered the words. Over the years, I repeated them to myself more times than I can count. Uncle Richard ran a manufacturing company that produced specialized machine parts. It wasn't glamorous. Most people had never heard of it. But it was successful. He often took me to work during school breaks. That's where many of my most important lessons began. I learned how to sweep warehouse floors, how to stock shelves, how to organize inventory. He never treated me like the owner's nephew. If anything, he expected more from me than everyone else. One summer, I complained about having to work while my friends were on vacation. He handed me a broom. Then he smiled. "You know what rich people who stay rich understand? What? Nothing is beneath them." At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I realize he was teaching me humility. He taught constantly, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through example. He paid every bill on time. He showed up when he promised. He treated janitors and executives with equal respect. He never bragged about money. In fact, most people would never have guessed how wealthy he was. One afternoon when I was 16, I asked why he drove an older Lincoln instead of a luxury sports car. His answer made me laugh. "Because the Lincoln is paid for." That was Uncle Richard. Practical, steady, grounded. The exact opposite of the chaos I'd grown up with. Meanwhile, my parents disappeared from my life entirely. No birthday cards, no Christmas calls, no letters, nothing. At first, I checked the mailbox constantly, then occasionally. Eventually, not at all. The silence became its own answer. As high school passed, something unexpected happened. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade. Not because I'd forgiven them, because I was busy building a life. I joined clubs, made friends, worked part-time, earned good grades. For the first time, I started imagining a future. When college acceptance letters arrived, Uncle Richard celebrated harder than I did. He took me out for steak, then embarrassed me by telling the waitress I was the first Harper to earn a full academic scholarship. By then, he wasn't just my guardian. He was my family. The only family who had consistently shown up. College brought new challenges. I attended a university in Illinois and studied business management. Money was tight despite scholarships. I worked evenings, interned during summers, graduated with very little debt. Throughout those years, Uncle Richard remained my biggest supporter. Every Sunday evening we'd talk on the phone, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. The conversations were rarely dramatic, mostly everyday life, work, classes, sports, weather. Yet those calls became an anchor, the kind of reliable presence many people take for granted. After graduation, I found a position with a manufacturing company. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Eventually, I worked my way into management, then senior management, then executive leadership. My career wasn't spectacular overnight. It was built the same way Uncle Richard built everything, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one responsibility at a time. Years passed. I bought a home, built savings, created stability, the very things I'd once feared I'd never have. Through it all, Uncle Richard remained my closest confidant. On the day I graduated from college, we stood together outside the auditorium. Families surrounded us, parents hugging children, grandparents taking photographs. I remember feeling a brief ache, a reminder of what I'd lost. Maybe Uncle Richard sensed it. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Everything I have I built." I smiled. "I know." Then he looked directly at me. "And one day you'll build something even better." At the time, I thought he was talking about money. Years later, I'd realize he meant something much bigger. Because while I was building a life somewhere else, another story was unfolding. A story involving my parents. A story involving debt, bad decisions, desperation. And after 15 years of silence, it was heading straight toward my front door. By the time I turned 28, life had settled into a rhythm I appreciated more with each passing year. I owned a comfortable home in Naperville, Illinois. Nothing extravagant. A 3-bedroom house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. I had a steady career, a respectable salary, and enough savings to sleep well at night. After everything that happened when I was 13, stability felt like a luxury. Uncle Richard often joked that I'd become more cautious with money than he was. He wasn't entirely wrong. The fear of losing everything never completely leaves a child who once had nowhere to go. One Saturday afternoon, while helping him organize old files at his house, I found a cardboard box labeled Family. Inside were photographs dating back decades, black and white pictures of grandparents I'd never met, holiday gatherings, birthday parties, family reunions. There were photos of my father as a young man, photos of my mother smiling beside him, photos of me as a toddler sitting on my father's shoulders. For a moment it felt strange looking at evidence that we had once been a normal family, or at least something that looked like one. I held up one picture. "Do you ever wonder what happened?" Uncle Richard glanced at it. "Every family has turning points. What was ours?" He thought about that. Then he said, "Pride. Pride. Your parents spent years making choices they didn't want to admit were wrong." He returned to sorting papers. "Pride makes people double down instead of apologizing." At the time, I didn't realize how accurate that observation would prove to be. A few years later, small pieces of information about my parents began reaching me through distant relatives. Not much, just occasional updates, the kind shared at weddings and funerals. My father had lost his longtime warehouse position after corporate restructuring. My mother reduced her work hours due to health issues. Their finances were becoming strained. Meanwhile, my younger brother Kyle had developed a reputation. Unfortunately, not a good one. The same pattern that had protected him as a child followed him into adulthood. Nothing was ever his fault. Failed jobs, broken relationships, mounting debt. Someone else was always to blame. The stories became increasingly troubling. Credit card problems, personal loans, missed payments, then gambling. One cousin claimed Kyle had borrowed money from nearly every relative willing to answer his calls. I listened politely whenever updates surfaced, but I kept my distance. 15 years of silence creates a certain emotional numbness. I wasn't actively angry anymore. I simply wasn't involved. Then one Tuesday evening in early spring, everything changed. I was finishing dinner when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something made me answer. "Hello." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years. "Daniel." Every muscle in my body tightened. My mother, Linda Harper, the woman whose last words to me had been, "Don't expect us to come looking for you." I almost hung up. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I sat silently. "Daniel, I'm here." Her voice sounded older, softer, but instantly recognizable. "I've been thinking about you." I nearly laughed. 15 years, not 15 days, not 15 months. 15 years. Now she was thinking about me. "What do you want?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. I wanted to reconnect. Reconnect. Such a simple word. As if we'd merely drifted apart. As if she hadn't watched her 13-year-old son leave with a duffel bag and nowhere else to go. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. Mostly awkward small talk. She asked about my job, my home, my life. Nothing particularly emotional. Nothing resembling an apology. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. The experience left me unsettled. Not because I missed her. Because it felt calculated. Something about the conversation seemed off. Over the next several months, she called more frequently. Sometimes once a week. Sometimes twice. The pattern gradually became obvious. Every conversation eventually drifted toward one subject. Uncle Richard. How was his health? Was he still working? Had he retired? Did he travel much? Was he taking care of himself? The questions appeared casual, but there were too many of them. Eventually, I stopped answering in detail. That didn't stop her from asking. One evening, she became unusually direct. "Richard must be worth quite a bit these days." There it was. The question hiding beneath all the others. I kept my voice neutral. "He's done well." "I imagine he has." A pause. Then another. "You two are still very close." I suddenly understood. This wasn't about repairing our relationship. This wasn't about regret. This wasn't about motherhood. It was about money. More specifically, potential inheritance. The realization didn't hurt nearly as much as I expected. Maybe because I'd grown older. Maybe because I'd already accepted who she was. Still, there was disappointment. Even after all those years, she remained exactly the same. After that conversation, I told Uncle Richard everything. We were sitting on his back patio drinking coffee. The sun was setting behind the trees. He listened quietly, then smiled. "Doesn't surprise me." "You think she's interested in your money?" "I think some people see dollar signs where they should see people." That was all he said. Typical Uncle Richard. No bitterness. No anger. Just observation. At that point, he was 73. Retired from daily operations at the company, but still involved as chairman. His health remained good overall. A few aches. A few medications. Normal aging. Nothing alarming. At least that's what we thought. The summer passed peacefully. Then autumn arrived. And with it came the phone call that changed everything. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was preparing for a meeting when my cell phone rang. The screen showed a number from Richard's office. I answered immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to his longtime assistant, Karen. She sounded frightened. "Daniel," my stomach dropped. "What happened?" "There was an incident." I was already reaching for my car keys. "What kind of incident?" Karen hesitated. Then she said the words every family member dreads hearing. "Richard suffered a heart attack." The drive to the hospital felt endless. Traffic lights became enemies. Every slow-moving vehicle felt unbearable. By the time I arrived, doctors were already speaking with staff members. One look at their faces told me everything. I never got the chance to say goodbye. The man who had saved my life at 13 was gone. 73 years old. A lifetime of hard work. A lifetime of generosity. Gone in a single morning. The funeral took place several days later. Hundreds attended. Employees, friends, neighbors, business associates. People whose lives he had quietly improved over decades. And then, as I stood greeting mourners, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. My mother, my father, and my brother Kyle, all walking through the church doors together. For the first time in 15 years, my entire family stood in the same room. And judging by the expression on my mother's face, they hadn't come simply to pay their respects. The church was packed on the day of Uncle Richard's funeral. Rows of polished wooden pews stretched from the front altar to the rear doors. People filled nearly every seat. Former employees sat beside business executives. Retirees sat beside young families. Veterans, teachers, church members, and longtime friends all came to honor a man whose generosity had touched more lives than most people realized. As I stood near the front greeting mourners, I heard the church doors open. When I looked up, I froze. My mother was the first to enter. My father followed a few steps behind. Kyle came last. For a brief moment, 15 years disappeared. I wasn't a successful adult standing in a church. I was 13 years old again, standing on a porch with a duffel bag while my family watched me leave. My mother spotted me immediately. Her expression transformed into what appeared to be sadness, but something about it felt rehearsed. She hurried toward me. "Daniel." I nodded politely. "Mom." The word felt strange leaving my mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, or at least what looked like tears. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry about Richard." I simply nodded again. My father shifted awkwardly beside her. Kyle avoided eye contact entirely. The silence stretched. Finally, my mother placed a hand on my arm. "We need to spend more time together after all this." There it was again. The sudden interest in family. The timing wasn't lost on me. "Today is about Uncle Richard," I replied. She forced a smile. "Of course." Then she leaned closer. "So many people here." I glanced around. "There are." He must have left quite a legacy. The comment seemed innocent enough. Yet somehow it landed wrong. Very wrong. The service began a few minutes later. The pastor spoke about kindness, integrity, service, the values Richard had demonstrated throughout his life. Several former employees shared stories. One man described how Richard had quietly paid his medical bills after a workplace injury. Another spoke about a scholarship Richard had funded without seeking recognition. A widow tearfully explained how Richard had helped her family keep their home after her husband died. Story after story painted the same picture. A man who gave far more than he took. A man who never sought applause. A man who showed up when people needed him. As I listened, I realized something. Nearly every meaningful lesson in my life had come from him. Not from my parents. Not from teachers. Not from bosses. From Richard. The loss felt overwhelming. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall. Conversations filled the room. Memories were exchanged. Photographs were displayed. Coffee and sandwiches sat untouched on many tables. Meanwhile, my mother seemed unusually energized. She moved through the crowd, introducing herself to people she'd never met. Several times I overheard her mentioning that she was Richard's sister-in-law. She seemed eager for everyone to know the connection. At one point, I found her speaking with 2 distant relatives. "Richard always cared about family," she was saying. "That's just who he was." The relatives nodded politely. Then my mother added something that made my stomach tighten. "I'm sure he made provisions for family members." The implication was obvious. She was already thinking about the estate. The funeral had ended less than an hour earlier. Over the next few days, the behavior became even more noticeable. Word spread that Richard's estate was substantial. Nobody knew exact numbers, but everyone knew he had built a successful company and accumulated significant assets. Suddenly, relatives who hadn't spoken to him in years began sharing stories about how close they'd been. My mother became one of the most enthusiastic storytellers. The transformation would have been impressive if it hadn't been so transparent. One afternoon, she called me. "Have you heard anything from the attorney?" I was sitting in my office reviewing contracts. "No." "Oh." A pause. Then another. "When is the will reading?" I leaned back in my chair. "I don't know yet." "Well, they usually happen fairly quickly." I noticed she said they as if she had extensive experience attending inheritance proceedings. A few seconds later, she asked the question she really wanted answered. "Do you know who Richard named in the will?" "No." Another pause. "Interesting." The conversation ended shortly afterward. I stared at the phone. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. She wasn't grieving. She was calculating. A week later, the attorney handling Richard's estate contacted me. His name was Michael Bennett. He had worked with Richard for years. Professional. Meticulous. The kind of attorney who chose every word carefully. He informed me that the formal reading of the will would take place the following month. Several family members would be invited. When I mentioned my parents' sudden interest, he became unusually quiet. Then he said something curious. "Mr. Harper anticipated a great many things." "What does that mean?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss the contents of the will beforehand." His tone remained polite, yet I sensed there was more behind the statement. After we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What exactly had Richard anticipated? As the date approached, tension continued building. Then came another phone call from my mother. This one was different. She sounded almost cheerful. "I bought a new outfit." "For what?" "The will reading." I nearly dropped the phone. "You bought an outfit?" "Well, it's an important occasion." An important occasion. Not a solemn legal process following the death of a loved one. An occasion. Like a celebration. Like a party. The next few minutes revealed even more. She casually mentioned paying off certain debts. Discussed helping Kyle get back on his feet. Talked about taking a vacation she'd postponed for years. The money hadn't even been distributed. The will hadn't even been read. Yet she was already spending it in her mind. By the time the conversation ended, I felt equal parts angry and amazed. Some people could convince themselves of anything. The morning of the will reading arrived cold and gray. The law office occupied the top floor of a downtown Chicago building. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. When I arrived, several relatives were already there. Conversations remained polite but tense. Everyone knew why they had come. Everyone wondered what Richard had decided. Then the elevator doors opened. My mother stepped out wearing an expensive navy blue suit. My father followed. Kyle trailed behind. But it wasn't their arrival that caught my attention. It was my mother's expression. She looked confident, victorious, as though the outcome had already been decided. As though she had spent the inheritance before hearing a single word of the will. She walked into the conference room smiling, and for the first time I realized just how shocked she was about to be. The conference room felt smaller than it actually was. Maybe it was the tension. Maybe it was the anticipation. Or maybe it was the simple reality that everyone sitting around that long mahogany table believed they were about to learn what Uncle Richard thought of them. The room occupied the corner of the law firm's top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. The city moved normally outside. Inside, however, nobody seemed interested in the view. Every eye was fixed on attorney Michael Bennett. He sat at the head of the table with several folders arranged neatly in front of him. Professional. Calm. Impossible to read. My mother sat 3 seats away from me. She looked remarkably comfortable. Almost excited. Every few minutes she exchanged glances with Kyle. Occasionally she whispered something to him. Each time he nodded. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I could practically see the dollar signs floating through their minds. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bennett cleared his throat. The conversation stopped. Thank you all for attending. His voice carried easily across the room. As you know, we are here to review the final wishes of Richard Harper. Everyone settled into silence. Before discussing specific distributions, I would like to note that Mr. Harper spent considerable time preparing his estate plan. Every detail was reviewed extensively and documented according to his instructions. Something about the statement caught my attention. The wording felt deliberate, almost like a warning. My mother didn't seem to notice. She sat straighter in her chair. Bennett opened the first folder. The reading began. Several charitable organizations received substantial gifts. A veterans assistance program, a local food bank, educational scholarship funds, community development projects. The amounts were significant. Nobody seemed surprised. Richard had always believed strongly in giving back. Next came personal gifts. A longtime employee received a generous retirement trust. Several close friends received meaningful bequests. A church received funding for future outreach programs. As Bennett continued reading, I noticed my mother's growing impatience. She shifted in her chair, checked the attorney's face, glanced toward Kyle. The larger distribution still hadn't appeared, and everyone knew it. Finally, Bennett turned another page. We will now address the remaining family provisions. The atmosphere changed instantly. Every person in the room leaned forward slightly. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. A cousin received a modest inheritance. An aunt received a charitable trust established in her name. Several relatives received personal keepsakes and smaller financial gifts. My mother smiled. The smile grew wider with every passing minute. Clearly, she believed the major announcement was still coming. Then Bennett spoke her name. Linda Harper. My mother visibly brightened. The attorney looked down at the document. Mr. Harper directs that Linda Harper receive a one-time distribution of $50,000. The smile remained. At first, $50,000 was certainly substantial. But judging from her reaction, she clearly expected much more. Still, she maintained her composure. She probably assumed larger amounts were coming later. Then Bennett continued. The remaining majority interest in Mr. Harper's estate, including ownership holdings, investment assets, personal property, and residual financial interests, shall transfer to Daniel Harper. Silence. Absolute silence. The words seemed to hang in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, even breathing felt loud. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. My mother. Her face had gone completely pale. What? The word escaped before she could stop it. Bennett calmly continued reading. But she interrupted. No. Several people turned toward her. No, she repeated more loudly. That can't be right. The attorney lowered the document. It is correct. My mother stared at him, then at me, then back at him. That's impossible. Bennett's expression never changed. Mrs. Harper, the document is legally valid. Kyle looked stunned. My father looked like a man watching a train wreck unfold in slow motion. But my mother wasn't finished. She pushed her chair backward. This doesn't make sense. No one answered. She pointed directly at me. He's not Richard's son. The room became even quieter. He was my son. The irony of the statement nearly took my breath away. Your son. Now she remembered. Now, after 15 years, Bennett folded his hands. Mr. Harper's decisions were clearly documented. Family should come first. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. I could see exactly what they were thinking. Many of them knew at least pieces of the story. Some knew more than others. But nobody knew everything. Not yet. My mother's voice rose. This is ridiculous. She turned toward me. You manipulated him. I stared at her. For years I had imagined this moment. Not this exact situation, but a confrontation, a reckoning, an opportunity to finally speak. And suddenly I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the performance. Tired of pretending history hadn't happened. I slowly stood. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. My mother crossed her arms. Well, I looked directly at her. When was the last birthday card you sent me? Her expression faltered. Nobody had expected that question. What? When was the last Christmas present? Silence. When was the last phone call before Uncle Richard got sick? Her face tightened. That's not relevant. It is. I turned toward the rest of the room. Several relatives watched carefully. Some looked confused. Others looked increasingly uncomfortable. You want to talk about family? My voice remained calm. Steady. Let's talk about family. My mother shook her head. Daniel. No. For the first time in 15 years, I refused to let her control the conversation. You threw me out when I was 13. The words landed like a hammer. A few relatives gasped. Others stared at my parents. My mother immediately responded. That's not what happened. It isn't. You were difficult. A nervous laugh escaped me. Difficult. The room remained frozen. I looked around the table, then back at her. I was 13 years old. Nobody spoke. I sat outside in the rain with a duffel bag because my parents didn't want me. The color drained from Kyle's face. My father lowered his eyes. And for the first time since entering the room, my mother's confidence disappeared. But she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny, to rewrite history. Then Attorney Bennett quietly reached for another folder, a much thicker folder. The moment I saw it, I knew something was coming. Something Uncle Richard had prepared long before any of us entered this room. Bennett placed the folder on the table. The sound echoed through the silence. Then he looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Harper, before you continue, there is additional documentation Mr. Harper instructed me to present if this situation occurred. And suddenly, for the first time all morning, my mother looked afraid. Attorney Michael Bennett rested one hand on the thick folder. Nobody in the room spoke. The confidence my mother had carried into the conference room was gone now. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain. What documentation? She asked. Bennett opened the folder carefully. Mr. Richard Harper anticipated the possibility that certain individuals might challenge his decisions regarding the estate. My mother swallowed. The attorney removed several documents. Over the years, Mr. Harper maintained extensive records. My stomach tightened. I hadn't known that. Not completely. I knew Richard was organized. I knew he kept paperwork. But I had no idea how much. Bennett pulled out the first document. This is the guardianship agreement filed when Daniel Harper was 13 years old. He slid copies across the table. Several relatives began reading. The room grew even quieter. My mother's eyes darted across the pages, then she looked away. Bennett continued. This agreement was signed voluntarily. No one missed the emphasis. Voluntarily. Not forced. Not temporary. Voluntarily. The next document appeared. Then another. And another. School records. Court filings. Social worker reports. Correspondence. Every piece told the same story. A 13-year-old boy had been removed from his parents' care, not because of abuse investigations, not because of criminal activity, because his parents no longer wanted responsibility for him. I watched several relatives exchange stunned looks. One aunt covered her mouth. A cousin slowly shook his head. The family story my parents had quietly promoted over the years was collapsing in real time. My mother finally spoke. Those papers don't tell the whole story. Bennett nodded. Mr. Harper anticipated that response as well. He opened another section of the folder. This time he removed several handwritten letters. My heart skipped. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Richard's. The attorney selected one. This letter was written shortly after Daniel moved to Illinois. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. Richard described finding me sitting alone outside after being ordered to leave. He described conversations with my parents. He described offering to take responsibility because no one else would. The letter wasn't angry. That was the remarkable thing. It wasn't filled with insults or blame. It simply documented facts, calmly, carefully, the way Richard always handled difficult situations. When Bennett finished reading, nobody spoke. The truth had weight, and everyone in the room could feel it. My mother stared at the table. Kyle looked physically uncomfortable. My father remained silent. Then Bennett pulled out another document. This one is particularly important. He handed copies around the room. I took mine and looked down. The document was dated nearly 10 years earlier. It was a formal statement signed by Richard, a letter of intent regarding his estate. One paragraph had been highlighted. Bennett read it aloud. If any beneficiary challenges this will on the grounds that family relationships entitle them to a greater inheritance, my attorney is instructed to provide documentation regarding Daniel Harper's abandonment and subsequent guardianship. Such challenges shall be considered evidence that the individual has learned nothing from the circumstances that led to these decisions. The room sat frozen. My mother's face had become completely expressionless. Bennett wasn't finished. There is one additional provision. Now everyone was paying attention. Every person in that room sensed something significant was coming. The attorney turned another page. Then he looked directly at my mother. Mr. Harper included a no-contest clause. I saw confusion on several faces, Bennett explained. A no-contest clause means any beneficiary who formally contests the will forfeits their inheritance. The realization spread across the room, slowly. Then all at once, my mother's eyes widened. What? The attorney continued. The $50,000 distribution to Linda Harper was conditional upon acceptance of the will. The room became so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. My mother's voice trembled. You're saying, by challenging the validity of the estate distribution, you have activated the clause. Her mouth opened. No words came out. Bennett finished calmly. You have forfeited the inheritance. The silence that followed felt endless. $50,000. Gone. Not because Richard had taken it away, because she had thrown it away herself. Several relatives stared at her in disbelief. Others looked away. My father slowly closed his eyes. It was the reaction of a man who knew exactly how predictable this outcome had been. Kyle finally spoke. You've got to be kidding. I'm not, Bennett replied. The language is very clear. Kyle turned toward my mother. For the first time all morning, frustration appeared on his face. Mom, she ignored him. Instead, she looked at me. Not with anger, not with outrage. With something else. Something I hadn't seen before. Shame. Real shame. The room remained still. Nobody rushed to her defense. Nobody argued with the documents. The evidence was overwhelming. 15 years of excuses had collided with reality, and reality had won. Then something unexpected happened. My mother began to cry. Not dramatic tears, not the performative emotion she'd displayed at the funeral. These were different. Quiet, uncontrolled, human. For a moment I didn't know how to feel. Part of me remembered being 13. Remembered the porch, the rain, the duffel bag, the years of silence. Another part saw an aging woman sitting across the table confronting consequences she could no longer escape. Bennett closed the folder. His work was finished. The truth was now public. No arguments remained. No misunderstandings. No alternative versions of history. Only facts. Richard had anticipated every possibility. Even from beyond the grave he had protected me. Exactly as he always had. My mother wiped her eyes. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I didn't think it would end like this. Neither had I. But in that moment I realized something important. The inheritance was never the real victory. The money mattered. Of course it did. But that wasn't why Richard had prepared those documents. He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was making sure the truth survived. Making sure nobody could rewrite what happened. Making sure a 13-year-old boy who had once been discarded would never again be made to feel invisible. As people slowly began gathering their belongings, my mother remained seated, motionless, broken. And for the first time in 15 years, I wondered whether this painful day might finally force her to confront the one thing she had avoided for most of her life, the truth about what she had done. The weeks after the will reading were strangely quiet. For 15 years, I had imagined what it might feel like to finally confront my parents. I expected satisfaction, relief, maybe even celebration. Instead, what I felt most was exhaustion. Some battles last so long that winning them doesn't feel like victory. It feels like reaching the finish line after you've spent years carrying a weight nobody else could see. The estate settlement took several months. Richard's business interests were transferred. Financial accounts were reviewed. Charitable commitments were honored. Scholarship funds were established according to his instructions. Throughout the process, I found myself reading many of his old letters and notes. Richard had documented more than finances. He had documented values, principles, lessons, the kind of wisdom older generations often leave behind if someone is willing to listen. One note in particular stayed with me. It was written on a yellow legal pad. His handwriting was unmistakable. It read, "Money reveals character, it rarely changes it." The more I reflected on everything that had happened, the more I understood exactly what he meant. About 3 months after the will reading, my phone rang late one evening. The number looked familiar. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I answered. "Hello," a soft voice responded. "Daniel, my mother." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different this time. Not tense, not manipulative. Just uncomfortable. Finally, she said, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me." I remained quiet. I don't blame you. That sentence caught me off guard. For once, there was no excuse attached to it. No explanation. No attempt to redirect responsibility. Just acknowledgement. We spoke for nearly an hour. And for the first time in 15 years, we had an honest conversation. Not a pleasant conversation. An honest one. There is a difference. She admitted that she and my father had been overwhelmed when I was young. Financial stress, marital problems, immaturity, poor decisions. But eventually she stopped talking about circumstances. Because circumstances weren't the real issue. Choices were. "We failed you," she said quietly. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because I needed revenge anymore, but because I'd waited decades to hear them. "I know," I replied. She started crying. And this time I believed the tears. Over the next several months we spoke occasionally. Not often. Not like a close family. More like two people carefully rebuilding a bridge that had collapsed long ago. Trust doesn't return because someone apologizes. Trust returns because actions change over time. One conversation became several. Several became regular check-ins. Then one afternoon she asked if we could meet in person. I agreed. We chose a small restaurant halfway between our homes. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet place where nobody knew us. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Not physically. Emotionally. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. The entitlement was gone. Age had softened her. Consequences had humbled her. For 2 hours we talked. About the past. About mistakes. About regrets. There were tears. There were uncomfortable silences. There were moments when neither of us knew what to say. But there was honesty. Finally. Honesty. Before we left, she looked at me and asked a question I had never expected to hear. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I thought about Richard. About everything he had taught me. Then I answered truthfully. "I already have." She began crying again. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." She nodded. "I know." And for the first time I believed she actually did. My relationship with my father improved more slowly. He wasn't a man comfortable discussing emotions. Never had been. Still, over time, progress happened. Small conversations became longer ones. Awkward meetings became easier. The wounds never disappeared completely. Some scars remain. But scars are different from open wounds. They hurt less. Kyle surprised me the most. After years of financial disasters, he finally accepted responsibility for his own life. The process wasn't quick or easy, but it was real. One afternoon, he admitted something that stayed with me. "I spent my whole life expecting someone else to fix my problems." I laughed softly. "That's a rough lesson." "Yeah," he smiled. "Wish I'd learned it sooner." Richard's estate gave me financial security beyond anything I had imagined. But the most important decision came afterward. What would I do with it? The answer arrived naturally. I would continue what he started. Within a year, I established the Richard Harper Scholarship Foundation. The program focused on helping teenagers facing family hardship. Not just abandoned children. Any young person whose circumstances threatened their future. Students, foster children, kids living with grandparents, young people trying to build lives despite difficult beginnings. Every scholarship carried Richard's name. Every award carried his values: responsibility, integrity, perseverance, hope. The first scholarship ceremony took place 2 years after his death. Nearly 100 people attended: community leaders, teachers, families, students. And surprisingly, my mother volunteered to help organize the event. At first, I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Then I remembered something Richard once told me. People are capable of change. Not everyone changes, but some do. Watching her help those students, I realized she was trying. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but sincerely. As the years passed, our family never became ideal. Life isn't a Hallmark movie. Broken relationships don't magically become perfect. But we became something healthier, something honest. Boundaries existed. Memories remained. Yet there was also respect, and sometimes that's enough. Several years later, I stood beside a bronze plaque outside the Scholarship Foundation's headquarters. Richard's name was engraved across the top. Below it were dozens of names belonging to students whose lives had been changed. I thought about the frightened 13-year-old boy sitting alone on a porch in Ohio. The boy who believed nobody wanted him. The boy who thought his life was ending. He couldn't have imagined this moment. He couldn't have imagined that one man's kindness would alter the course of everything. Richard left me a fortune. That much is true. But the greatest inheritance was never money. It was character, values, purpose, a blueprint for how to live. And that's worth more than any estate. If this story has reminded you of someone who changed your life, or someone you still need to forgive, take a moment to think about them today. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is gratitude. Sometimes the hardest gift is forgiveness. And sometimes both can change a family forever. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, family second chances, and justice, be sure to follow along for the next journey.